Today's podcast of Hellbent for Horror is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Hellbent for Horror. Audible has over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Hi, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror. I'm S.A. Bradley, and I'm a lifelong movie lover, but my heart belongs to horror. My biggest thrill, however, is getting to talk to people about this stuff. I really want to start conversations with you. And I'm really happy to say that the last episode got some conversations rolling. I want to take a moment to say thank you to some of the listeners who sent me messages. In that episode, I made a case that some movies that get called dramas and thrillers are really horror films in disguise. I called out the obvious, like Silence of the Lambs, and the not-so-obvious, like Deliverance and Dirty Harry. One listener, Bradley J. Cornish, sent his own list of movies he considers horror films in disguise. His list: Apocalypse Now, Cape Fear, both the Scorsese version and the J. Lee Thompson versions, Eraserhead, Rear Window, Seven, Dead Ringers, Antichrist, Arsenic and Old Lace, and Blue Velvet. Pretty respectable list. Personally, I can't see how anyone could look at Eraserhead as anything but a horror movie, but I guess some do. If you'd like to ask Bradley to prove his point on any of these movies, he has a Twitter page for his company, Black Ark Studios. That's at Black Ark Studios. Bradley writes horror and dark fiction, so I'll bet he'd be happy to give you his educated opinion. And I want to open my conversation to everybody out there listening. If you've got a movie you'd like to add to the list of horror movies in disguise, email me or IM me and tell me which movie and why you think it's a horror movie. Now, the why is important, right? Just because a movie has a scary scene in it doesn't mean it's a horror movie. Convince me, and I'll mention you, the movie, and your argument for the defense on an upcoming podcast. And I look forward to it because when someone makes me look at a movie with different eyes, I love that. And that's what's great about loving movies and talking with other movie lovers. One person's trash is another person's treasure. And if they have the passion and the drive to make the case, they can get you to see the treasure where you only saw trash. One person can change the way you look at a movie. And the same can be said for the people who make the movies. One inventive and persuasive filmmaker can change movies for you forever. And sometimes there's a moment in history, like Paris in the 1920s, where a group of artists simultaneously push art forms in a different direction. And then we call it a movement. A very well-documented movement happened in 1970s Hollywood when a new breed of filmmakers came in and changed the rules. You hear the same names just like you would if you heard people name the pantheon of Greek gods. Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Arthur Penn, Robert Altman, Peter Bogdanavitch, Bob Rafelson, and even Steven Spielberg and George Lucas are included these days. Now, these guys earn their billing. Each of them made a great movie that changed the course of cinema and gave us Hollywood's last golden age. But that doesn't mean they only made good movies. Arthur Penn is remembered for bringing graphic violence and moral ambiguity to the mainstream with Bonnie and Clyde, but most people can't name another movie he made. Robert Altman is remembered for mixing violence and comedy in MASH and bringing realistic overlapping dialogue to movies like Nashville. But nobody brings up O.C. and Stiggs or Beyond Therapy or Quintet in that conversation. Francis Ford Coppola made perhaps the greatest American film of all time, The Godfather, and then he made Apocalypse Now. But Coppola has made more than his fair share of turkeys. Now, I'm not saying this stuff to bring these guys down, not at all. On the contrary, I'm saying that if you made at least one great movie that made an impact where it changed the direction of how movies look and feel, that's enough. That should command some respect. And with that said, there's at least one more name that never gets mentioned in that group, and it should. A few months ago, Guillermo del Toro, the famed director of movies like Pan's Labyrinth and The Devil's Backbone and Hellboy, started a tweet storm. He spent a weekend championing a filmmaker that inspired him when he was young. That filmmaker was John Carpenter. And Del Toro's tone was so unabashedly supportive and reverent, the tweets went viral. Here are some of Del Toro's tweets. When I think of John Carpenter, I'm amazed at the fact that we take him for granted. How can we? Why should we? He is lightning in a bottle. Here's another. We must all agree that Carpenter is a brilliant writer, director, a rare breed, a true auteur, and a hallowed composer. I have to admit, I got pulled into reading all these tweets over that weekend because this was pure passion, an unfiltered adoration from one artist for another. That smart, awkward teenager that Del Toro used to be came to the surface, and it was beautiful. And the thought that kept going through my mind was, thank you, it's not just me. It's probably obvious, but I have a real love for the work of John Carpenter, and it has always fascinated me and troubled me how easily dismissed his work was by not only movie critics, but also movie lovers. I mean, it's not just that he isn't included on that hallowed list of game-changing filmmakers. For decades, John Carpenter barely registered any respect in the American film community at all. Carpenter himself made an infamous comment about how he's perceived. In France, I'm an auteur. In Germany, a filmmaker. In Britain, a genre film director. And in the USA, I'm a bum. We're not just talking about a clerical error on the guest list for great directors. We're talking about a conscious devaluing of talent. Now, why do I say that? Because if you look at cinematic impact, John Carpenter altered the course of the horror film, not once, but twice in his career. Twice, he updated the look and feel of horror movies in ways that changed the direction of horror cinema and are still imitated today. And twice, he revolutionized the horror movie monster itself. 2 times, once to his great benefit and once to his great detriment. So why are Carpenter's achievements minimized while the other mavericks of the 1970s are venerated? I'll bet you've already figured that out. Horror will never be considered an equal when it comes to cinema. Never has and never will. Even though pop culture has taken over cinema, horror is still the red-headed stepchild. But even with the disrespect horror still gets these days, Guillermo del Toro and all of us horror hounds have got it easy. Because we're just following the trail that John Carpenter blazed. Or, more accurately, got his ass kicked down. Because however brief it was, John Carpenter gave modern horror a moment in the glow of the mainstream and still made great horror films while he was doing it. Sure, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was a game changer in the long run, but it was relegated to the drive-in circuit when it premiered. George Romero's Dawn of the Dead might have been the trailblazer if it wasn't marginalized by going without a rating to keep it from getting an X. It lost a lot of theaters and advertising because of that. So it was John Carpenter's original Halloween that was the first horror movie since The Exorcist to be scary enough and successful enough to impact the mainstream. Halloween sparked enough heat and brought in enough new fans that publications with huge readerships like People magazine and Rolling Stone did profiles on Carpenter. This was at a time where a new horror movie didn't even get reviewed in most newspapers. They just put a snobby, not reviewed by us next to the title. This was at a time when film critics were superstars themselves, and they held the power to shape public opinion and decide what was art and what wasn't. And in the middle of all that, John Carpenter's Halloween became a surprise hit, earned critical acclaim, and gave a new twist on an old monster and revitalized the horror movie. But not right away. When it was first released, Halloween was poorly reviewed, if reviewed at all. But all it takes is one voice. And in this case, it was the Village Voice, the hippest paper in New York City. And that got other critics to take a second look. Sure, there was luck and timing and serendipity that was involved in Halloween becoming what it became, just like every other movie ever made. But the single most important reason that Halloween became a runaway hit and changed the course of horror movies was the creation of The Shape, John Carpenter's perfect boogeyman. If you read interviews with Carpenter, he always says that Halloween was an assignment for him. Producer Irwin Yablans asked Carpenter if he could make a movie based on an idea he had about a masked killer who stalked babysitters over the course of one night. Carpenter and partner Deborah Hill started a draft of a story called The Babysitter Murders. Yablans found out that the word Halloween hadn't been copyrighted by anyone or used in a movie title before, so he suggested they use that title, Halloween, for the name recognition. So Carpenter was given a pretty unoriginal plot, but a pretty cool title. And Halloween could have ended up being just another run-of-the-mill second feature to drive in, and he still would have fulfilled that assignment he was given. Instead, Carpenter decided to take a risk and try out an ingenious experiment. The experiment was elegance in its simplicity, literally, and that experiment gave birth to The Shape. Carpenter believed that a lot of horror films weren't scary because there was too much explanation of the what and the why of the monster. Explanations would just kill all the tension and suspense the movie worked to build up. Not knowing was what was really scary. An example of this is the last 5 minutes of Psycho. You just had one of the biggest shocks in cinema history, and then you cut to 5 minutes of a psychiatrist clinically explaining why Norman Bates did what he did. Up until then, Norman Bates could be any boy in any town, and he could kill for any reason or no reason at all. But after that 5 minutes, he's the boy with serious mother issues who can't help himself. That is a very different boogeyman than the one that scared the shit out of you in the shower. Carpenter believed that the lack of information or motivation or even an answer to the why the killer does what he does was what was really frightening. If the audience was given the minimum amount of detail, the minimum amount of explanation, what would their imaginations fill the blank spaces with? In a way, Carpenter was doing a variation on an experiment done during the silent film era by Russian filmmaker Dziga Vertov. For his Kino Pravda experiment, Vertov shot a close-up of a man with a blank stare on his face. Then he spliced random film clips together around that blank stare. The clips would be things like a tombstone and a crying baby and boiling water on a stove. Then Vertov would ask the viewer what the man was thinking. If the tombstone was set in front of the blank stare, the viewer thought the man was in mourning. If the tombstone shot came after that, they thought he feared that someone was dying or he killed himself. If the image of the crying baby came on before the boiling water shot, the baby was hungry. If the boiling water came on before the crying baby, viewers thought the baby got burned. The audience just had to fill that blank stare with meaning. They filled it with their fear and their grief. And John Carpenter was going to extend this experiment to a full-length film. Carpenter set out to make a killer that was maybe human, maybe supernatural, maybe both. He wouldn't give the audience an answer. For the look of The Shape, Carpenter wanted the least amount of detail he could get. He went with gray mechanic coveralls that had very few body lines to it. And then he had to work on the pale white face he wrote in the script. Production designer Tommy Lee Wallace found a cheap Captain Kirk mask, widened the eyes, messed the hair, and spray painted the face a bluish white. When actor Nick Castle got into the costume, it was creepy. It was scary, even though there was nothing there. It made an impact. Carpenter had removed as much information from the look of The Shape as he could. Now he worked to remove the identity, the humanity. The Shape doesn't talk. The only sound he makes is heavy breathing behind the mask. The Shape doesn't run. He walks in steady, inevitable, straight lines. The Shape doesn't scream in pain or get angry. No displays of emotion, except for maybe curiosity. The Shape is an average-sized male. Could be anyone. And The Shape doesn't necessarily hide as much as he just stands still and blends in like a chameleon while he watches you, motionless, hunting. We get nothing more. And then Carpenter worked to remove the why of The Shape. In Halloween, we think we're told more than we actually are. Take the absolutely brilliant opening scene. At the end of that shot, we find out that 6-year-old Michael Myers just stabbed his sister to death on Halloween night. It seems like we got a lot of information. Michael just murdered his sister. But we have no idea why. We are never told. We get no motive. We need to fill in the blanks for ourselves. And we know this is the night he came home. But we don't know why he came home. We fill in that too. And we know he's stalking babysitter Laurie Strode and her 2 babysitter friends. But we don't know why. We fill that in too. And that's why The Shape was so effective. Even though we're all watching the same movie, we are each seeing a slightly different monster with slightly different and personal motivations from our own personal fears. Dr. Loomis, Michael's psychiatrist, calls him evil and not a man. But we never know why he thinks that, except that Michael has a blank, emotionless face and the blackest of eyes. So we imagine what those eyes look like. When reason fails us, we turn to our emotions. Of course, all of this could have just collapsed in one big mess. And there are a lot of things in Halloween that were cliches back in 1978, like the general plot, or the creepy phone calls where nobody speaks on the other side, or the killer who you think is dead, but he isn't. But that's the genius of Halloween. Carpenter knows you know these are cliches and you have expectations around them. He puts The Shape into this mix and it subverts all the cliches on you. We are thrown off guard just by this figure appearing and disappearing at will in the frame. Sometimes The Shape is inches from his prey. When we expect someone to die, it doesn't happen. This movie isn't following the rhythms we were trained to expect. We don't get the release of a shock. We get more suspense, and that keeps us tense. You expect the phone calls to be the old killer calling from inside the house trick. But the call comes from another house, and Laurie is lured out of a safe place into danger. Instead of a cheap shock, we get the suspense of knowing what Laurie doesn't and watching helplessly as she walks towards the doom. And then, the biggest cliche of them all, the killer who you think is dead, but he isn't. And this is Carpenter's greatest trick in the movie. This is where everything he set up about the blank space that The Shape is, and all the suggestions from Loomis about him being pure evil, pay off. The first time The Shape goes down for the count and rises back up, it's a cliche. The second time he rises back up in the background, it's not for a cheap shock. It's for suspense. We feel dread. It's intense. The third time, after being shot multiple times by Loomis and falling off a balcony only to be gone before Loomis can look down at the ground, it is a revelation. Even with all the arrows pointing to this end, we are surprised. We hear The Shape breathing over shots of locations around Haddonfield, and we feel we just saw a legend get born. Not bad for a director who just wanted to make westerns. I knew Halloween was going to be something special when both my dad and the popular girls at school loved it. That is not the traditional demographic. And the movie was so successful that John Carpenter became a brand-name director, even though he made horror movies. And I think it's important to talk about Carpenter's style here, because aspects of that style are why I think he was able to successfully bridge demographic and generational gaps at the height of his career. It wouldn't have mattered if Halloween was the most groundbreaking idea if it didn't look and feel like a real movie. And I think that Carpenter's musical background, his first love, helped that a lot. Not only did he compose a timeless theme, but also the movie itself glides like music. The camera is rarely at rest, and when it is, you feel it. The editing in the movie is the same way. It complements the music and the scene in a way that feels invisible until you look for it. As my dad would say at that time, John Carpenter's movies were classy. And that brings up an aspect that I think helped Halloween become a crossover hit. Even though the story was modern, exploitative, and there was teenage sex and pot smoking, the movie was made with a lot of restraint. Compared to other horror films of the time, Halloween felt like part of its soul was from a different time period of filmmaking. It might have been the influence of Westerns or the influence of Howard Hawks, who inspired some of Carpenter's style, or merely budgetary reasons. But Halloween wasn't only scary, it was also dignified. And that mixture of restraint and solid filmmaking continued with The Fog, an elegant ghost story that feels like an homage to old EC comics. By the time Carpenter made Escape from New York, he was consistently getting decent reviews and good box office, and the studios were showing a lot of interest. It was big news when John Carpenter was signed on to remake Howard Hawks' The Thing from Another World. Of course, John Carpenter wasn't interested in just doing a scene-by-scene remake of a classic film that was already beloved by generations of fans. He had reinvented the horror movie monster with Halloween, and he was rewarded for it. He could do it again. And just like that, 4 years after Halloween made him a rising star, it would all come crashing down. Just like Halloween, The Thing was an assignment. Carpenter went back to the original novel to find his inspiration for this new vision, and he found the story of men trapped in an Antarctic research station with an alien life form that attacks and assimilates other life forms and then replicates them exactly. It's a parasitic imitation that can infiltrate the group quickly, and paranoia takes over the camp. And the idea that the alien can look like anything was very appealing to Carpenter, because there was another long-standing problem that horror movies had around monsters. Many old horror movies were great until the monster showed up. The curse of the rubber suit with the zipper. And even though the costume and makeup effects had gotten much better, it bothered Carpenter that aliens were always humanoid, bipedal. Even H.R. Giger's Alien, with the incredibly beautiful and disturbing head, still ends up just being a guy in a suit. This was a chance to make a truly unforgettable monster and make the only limitations the edges of the artist's imagination. And, working with genius makeup effects artist Rob Bottin, Carpenter unleashed the most incredible and disturbing creature effects in film up to that time. Now, there were gorier movies, but nothing as nightmarishly weird as The Thing. That edge of sanity weirdness was more disturbing than gallons of blood. This Thing was as close to Lovecraftian cosmic horror as anyone had ever dared. Horror that's incomprehensible to human minds, with monsters that are indifferent to whether we live or die. It is fair to read the alien in The Thing as neither good or bad, and that it just is. Now, there's no doubt that Carpenter pushed the envelope of what audiences could endure with the visual effects. I mean, the effects still make people gasp 30 plus years later. It is a strong-ass cup of coffee. And whether it's fair or not, I think that the very qualities of restraint and old-fashioned craftsmanship that brought crossover audiences to Halloween and The Fog hurt him here. Especially with the older generation, like my dad, who put a high value on those qualities. And it didn't help that Carpenter decided to change his style on the movie that my dad's generation held so close to their hearts. But it wasn't just the effects that caused the vitriolic audience and critical response to The Thing. It was the story that John Carpenter wanted to tell. I'm not sure which was more dangerous, the collaboration between Rob Bottin and Carpenter on effects, or the collaboration between Bill Lancaster and Carpenter on the story. I'd say it was dead even, because John Carpenter had the balls to update the social commentary as well as the monster in The Thing. And, just like the original Thing reflected the social anxieties of the early 1950s, Carpenter would continue that tradition by showing how he really saw the early 1980s. 1951's The Thing reflected the paranoia of the Red Scare and the Atomic Age. We were told to watch the skies. We were paranoid about what was out there. 1982's The Thing reflected that we were now paranoid of each other. We were told that man was the warmest place to hide. We were paranoid about what was in here, in our neighbors' hearts, in our own hearts. And that theme might be another reason why people were so angry about this movie. The paranoid don't like being told they're paranoid, especially when they're acting like everything is just fine. It was a dark theme, but it really shouldn't have been such a big surprise to everybody. If you really look at Carpenter's work, there was always a darkness there, and it was getting more pronounced with each film. In Halloween, evil is everywhere, like a facet of nature that we are ultimately helpless against. In The Fog, the sins of the past are never forgotten, and there will be an inevitable reckoning. In Escape from New York, the powers that be are as corrupt as the criminals, and the only remedy is to let the whole thing collapse. How could we have not seen the apocalypse coming? Carpenter might have been out of step with the aggressive, forced optimism of the early 80s, but he wasn't out of his own character. He was commenting on a society where people were no longer listening to each other, where people were no longer trusting each other, where it became every man for himself. And in the movie, a threat is introduced to this fractured group. And instead of coming together, we see each other as a possible threat. And when that happens, we start to lose our humanity. We transform into something ugly. We become an abomination of ourselves, a grotesque and twisted mutation. On the outside, we might seem the same, but on the inside, we are parasitical and alien. And when we lose that humanity, we lose the thing that separates us from the rest of the animals. We are no more significant than any of the other life forms the thing has assimilated before us. And in the movie, we physically see what this looks like, and it is hard to look at. In Halloween, Carpenter changed horror by giving us nothing and making our imaginations fill in the blanks with what scares us. The horror came from not knowing. In The Thing, he changed horror again by giving us everything. We see everything, more than we may want to. But the horror comes from the realization that even though we can see and know everything, it won't save us. We know the how of what the alien does. We know the why. We even know how long until humanity ends, 27,000 hours after first contact with a thing. And yet, we are helpless, because all of this knowledge doesn't matter. Because Carpenter isn't setting the world right again by explaining it. In fact, we feel even more fearful than when we were facing the unknown. Because now that we know what we know, we realize it's the end of the world as we know it, and we can't stop it. Unfortunately for Carpenter, he couldn't have predicted the hatred that this film created from both critics and audiences. The movie was even hated by horror and sci-fi fans. Starlog magazine, which was a torchbearer for Carpenter, wrote a review that said, "The thing smells, and smells pretty bad. It has no pace, sloppy continuity, zero humor, bland characters, on top of being totally devoid of either warmth or humanity. Here's some things Carpenter would be better suited to direct: traffic accidents, train wrecks, and public floggings." Cinema Fantastique magazine ran The Thing on its cover with the title, "Is this the most hated movie of all time?" And that hatred was so outsized that it caused serious damage to his career and, for a while, his confidence. His reputation would never completely recover with mainstream crossover audiences. And what is the killer in all of this is that he got it right. The Thing is a much better film than Halloween. The Thing is a masterpiece of atmospheric horror and sci-fi. There isn't a wasted moment in the film. It is immaculately shot and directed and acted. And like all great horror films, it is thought-provoking and timely beyond the period it was made. And it created precedent in not only horror effects, but for dark visions and commentaries to be accepted into mainstream films and even television. I remember watching the television show Fringe and seeing an effect inspired directly from The Thing. I turned to my wife and said, "Jesus Christ, John Carpenter was sent to Gulag for less than this, and he had an R rating to protect him." And this brings me back to another tweet by Guillermo del Toro. "One night, over dinner, I told John Carpenter how much all generations love The Thing, how amazing it was that it had over time found its audience and was now revered. "What fucking good does that do to me?" he said. We ordered dessert. So does John Carpenter deserve to be in the pantheon of Greek gods? Would he even care to be there now? I recently had a reawakening to the catalog of John Carpenter through a very unique experience. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but John Carpenter, the 68-year-old director of 18 feature films and 5 films for network and cable TV, went on tour this year in rock and roll band. Carpenter, along with his son Cody and his godson Daniel Davies, went on a 35-city worldwide tour to play a musical retrospective on his films. I'd say that qualifies as unique. I was front row at the Fox Theater in Oakland, California. Full house, 2,800 fans. The idea was that Carpenter would play a mixture of his movie themes and original material from his 2 full-length studio albums, Lost Themes 1 and 2. What I didn't know was that they would project clips from each of the films on a big screen while the band jammed. And that was an act of genius. Because it was probably the first time most of the audience had seen these images from the movies on a big screen and uncropped. And having the shots separated from the dialogue or any sound effects made us focus on the visuals to really read the screen and absorb the images. And I was struck at how beautiful the shots were, full of movement and color and shadow. This was pure storytelling through image, and it showed how much of an artist Carpenter really is. I was struck how beautiful the shot of Christine going down a narrow alley in silhouette was, or how wonderfully the shadows of ghost pirates in the fog play like German expressionism, or how smoothly the camera glides from a cramped tunnel into a huge arena full of armed prisoners and escaped from New York, or how the frame goes from wide and bright in the beginning of Halloween to dark and claustrophobic by the end, and how the color orange is always present in the frame. Or just how horrible beautiful the first reveal of the thing inside of the dog kennel is, and that alien shade of cold blue light that's always creeping into the corners of the frame. Or the incredibly choreographed and edited battle around an 18-wheeler in a narrow San Francisco alley in Big Trouble in Little China. Or the perfectly timed and framed Western hero pose moment of Rowdy Roddy Piper entering a crowded bank with a shotgun and sunglasses and absolutely no bubblegum. And while I'm drinking in all these amazing images, I suddenly realize something. This isn't a concert. This is a victory lap. His first love was music, so he played in a rock band named Kaleidoscope. His second love was movies, so he made himself a 40-year movie career. When he felt burned out by the movies, he turned into a recording artist. And then he started another rock band. John Carpenter has come full circle. And on stage, he is loving every minute of it. Like Napoleon Wilson says, you can't argue with a confident man. Thanks for listening to my show. I'd love to hear back from you. You can email me directly at scott@hellbentforhorror.com. For you, the listeners of Hellbent for Horror, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/hellbentforhorror. If you like the show and you're curious about audiobooks, sign up for the service through Hellbent for Horror. It helps make this podcast sustainable for me, and I thank you in advance. And thanks for listening. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. If you like the show, please consider writing a review on iTunes or Google Play. It really helps. Thanks a lot for listening. You can now subscribe to the Hellbent for Horror podcast. It's now available on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. You can also keep up with Hellbent for Horror on iTunes at iTunes Podcast. That's on Twitter. You can find more on our Facebook page at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and I'm on Twitter at hellbenthorror. You can also find more info on my website, hellbentforhorror.com. Till next time, stay hell-bent.